The morning sun was still low over the Solomon Sea, turning the scattered clouds into streaks of gold, when Lieutenant Masao Fujimura first saw them. He had been flying combat patrols for almost 2 years, and by now he thought he knew every kind of enemy machine the Americans could put in the sky. The grey silhouettes of the B-17s and B-24s no longer startled him. They were familiar targets, predictable in their behavior and sluggish in their response once the Zeros got in close. But what he saw now, rising above the thin cirrus at nearly 8,000 meters, didn't fit that familiar pattern. The shapes were broader, the wings longer, the fuselage bulkier, and their color, a muted matte brown that caught the sunlight. Without gleaming, was unlike the polished silver or dull grey he was used to. Through the glare of his canopy, they looked almost alive, moving not like lumbering bombers, but with a kind of deliberate momentum that unsettled him in ways he could not yet explain. Enemy bombers, same formation, his wingman called over the radio, his voice casual. It was easy to make that assumption. American bombers had been appearing in the skies over the Solomons with growing frequency, usually escorted by P-38s or Wildcats, usually flying low enough for the Zero's superior maneuverability to make short work of them. Fujimura acknowledged and banked left, beginning the familiar spiral climb that would carry his squadron into attack position. Below them, the green tapestry of jungle and the thin silver threads of rivers wound toward the sea, a landscape they had defended dozens of times before. But as the climb continued, something changed. The bombers were climbing too, not in the shallow, hesitant way that B-17s sometimes did, struggling against their own weight, but steadily, confidently, like predators choosing their ground. Fujimura watched his altimeter tick higher, 25,000 feet, 26,000, and felt the Zero's Nakajima engine straining in the thinning air. His squadron had never chased bombers this high before. Even their intelligence briefings had insisted that American heavy bombers rarely operated beyond 28,000 feet. Yet these machines were still climbing. Then came the next surprise. As the Japanese fighters closed the distance, the bombers tightened formation with uncanny precision, their spacing shrinking until they seemed to move as one vast, articulated shape. Fujimura knew from experience that the closer a formation flew, the more vulnerable it became to a coordinated attack. But here, the exact opposite appeared true. Streams of tracers arced out from every direction, nose, tail, dorsal, belly, crossing the sky in disciplined, lethal patterns. The Zero that dove in first, eager to score an early kill, was shredded before it could even line up a shot. Fujimura felt a cold weight in his stomach. B-17s had defensive guns, yes, but not like this. This was something else, a fortress bristling with steel teeth. As he closed to firing range, Fujimura saw the details clearly for the first time. The nose was longer, more pointed. The tail assembly taller and more robust. The engines, 4 of them, each belching a thin, pale exhaust, seemed larger than any radial he had seen, and their sound, even through the roar of his own engine, was deeper, heavier, like distant thunder. He pressed the trigger and watched a burst of 20mm shells tear into the flank of the nearest bomber. He expected smoke, a sudden loss of altitude, maybe even a fireball. Instead, the bomber shuddered, adjusted slightly, and continued on its course. Over the radio, confused chatter filled the channel. "Hit directly. Still flying. What are these things? They don't slow down." Fujimura pulled back and tried again, aiming for the engines this time. Another burst, another hit, and still the same result. The bomber kept moving, its formation unbroken, its altitude steady. It was only when they turned for home, fuel nearly spent and guns empty, that the full meaning of what they had seen began to settle over the returning pilots. The Americans had brought something new into the skies, A machine that did not behave like the bombers they had known, that shrugged off hits, that climbed beyond their reach, and flew with a calm inevitability that felt almost mechanical. As they landed and shut down their engines on the sun-baked airstrip, the ground crews gathered around their planes, expecting stories of another easy victory. Instead, the pilots spoke quietly, uncertainly, of brown bombers that would not fall. That night, Fujimura sat beneath the wing of his Zero and stared at the sky, still unable to shake the image of those distant shapes cutting through the clouds. They were not just planes, he realized. They were a message, one written not in gunfire, but in metal and altitude and unyielding momentum. Whatever war they had been fighting up to that point, it was changing, and Japan's pilots, for the first time, were no longer sure they would be able to keep up. The first encounters had been dismissed as flukes, lucky formations, chance weather, or perhaps a few heavily reinforced bombers that happened to survive more punishment than usual. That was the official explanation circulating among squadron leaders in the summer of 1943. But as the days turned into weeks and the sightings multiplied, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Again and again, patrols scrambled to intercept these brown, hulking shapes in the sky, and each time the same unsettling truths played out. They did not behave like any bomber Japanese pilots had ever fought. They did not slow down when attacked. They did not break formation when peppered with cannon fire. They did not fall when hit. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamazaki had flown more than 60 sorties over the Solomons and thought he had seen every trick the Americans could muster. He had watched B-17s scatter into desperate defensive circles when Zeros closed in. He had seen B-24s drop altitude and try to run when fuel tanks were punctured, but these new machines seemed bound by none of those old patterns. He watched one climb away from a frontal attack at an angle that seemed aerodynamically impossible, its four engines roaring as if indifferent to gravity itself. Even after Yamazaki scored direct hits on its starboard wing, it did not list or drop. It simply shifted slightly, as if brushing off a mosquito, and resumed its place in formation. That was the most unnerving thing of all. The formation. Japanese fighter doctrine thrived on breaking apart bomber groups, isolating stragglers, and then destroying them with concentrated bursts. Yet these aircraft refused to separate. Even under concentrated attack from an entire squadron, they held their V-shaped line with machine-like precision. Each bomber's gunners seemed to know exactly where their fire lanes were, their arcs of tracers interlocking in deadly webs that shredded any fighter foolish enough to press too close. Pilots who had once been confident hunters now spoke of the formations as if they were living things, coordinated, deliberate, and uncannily disciplined. At night, around the thin tables of the squadron ready rooms, conversations grew quieter and more uneasy. Maps were spread across surfaces, intercepted reports read aloud, sketches of the new aircraft passed from hand to hand. Some pilots insisted they were simply modified B-17s, heavier armor, perhaps, or new engines. Others whispered that they were entirely new models, perhaps even experimental prototypes brought into service earlier than anyone expected. The truth was that no one knew, and that ignorance weighed heavier than any enemy fire. Reports from other bases echoed the same experiences. In one engagement over Rabaul, an entire interceptor wing emptied their ammunition into a single bomber before watching it limp back toward Allied lines, still airborne. Over Truk, a group of A-6M fighters attempted to attack from above, the traditional weak point of most American bombers, only to watch in astonishment as the formation tightened, climbed again, and met them head-on with a curtain of defensive fire. A mission report from Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Kuroda summed up the new reality in a single line. Our tactics are becoming obsolete before we can even refine them. The confusion filtered upward, reaching briefing rooms in Rabaul and Tokyo. Intelligence officers pored over reconnaissance photos, searching for clues in wing shapes and engine cowlings. Engineers debated whether Japan could develop heavier cannon or faster interceptors to meet the new threat. Tacticians drafted revised manuals, suggesting steep diving attacks or coordinated multi-angle assaults, yet none of these tactics produced decisive results in the field. The enemy had changed the rules of engagement, and Japan's vaunted air superiority, once unquestioned in the early days of the Pacific War, was eroding with every sortie. Yamazaki remembered one engagement vividly. His unit had intercepted a formation over New Georgia at midday. They dove from above, coordinated and disciplined, the sun at their backs. By the book, it should have been a slaughter. Instead, it was a rout for them. 3 Zeros were torn apart by overlapping fields of 50 caliber fire before they closed to within 500 meters. Another was crippled by a single lucky shot from a tail gunner and spiraled into the sea. Yamazaki himself scored a dozen hits on one bomber's fuselage, close enough to see the flashes of impact. But it continued on, its contrails carving white. Lines against the deep blue sky, as though nothing had happened. When the survivors returned to base, silence filled the debriefing room. The commander looked at their gun camera footage again and again, as if searching for some error, some missed opportunity. But the conclusion was the same each time. These were not ordinary bombers. They were something else. Something built to endure, to resist, to defy the very logic of air combat as the Japanese understood it. And as word of these encounters spread across the Imperial Navy Air Service, a chilling realization took hold among the pilots. They were no longer the hunters. The balance of the skies was shifting, and the machines they had once mocked as slow and clumsy were rewriting the rules of war while still thousands of meters above their reach. Saburo Sakai had built his reputation on certainty. By 1943, he was one of the most celebrated fighter aces in the Imperial Japanese Navy, credited with dozens of victories from China to the Pacific. His reflexes were honed, his instincts lethal, and his confidence absolute. To Sakai, American bombers were lumbering beasts, noisy, predictable, and always destined to fall under the Zero's razor-sharp claws. So when word came that another formation of the strange new brown aircraft had been spotted over Bougainville, he saw it as an opportunity to prove that nothing in the enemy's arsenal could withstand a determined attack from Japan's finest pilot. He gathered his wingmen on the tarmac at Rabaul with the same calm assurance that had carried him through years of war. "They may be tougher," he told them, "but they still bleed when struck." The mission began like countless others. As Sakai's flight climbed toward interception altitude, the familiar rhythms of combat preparation set in. Engine checks, formation calls, a quick scan of the horizon. But as they neared contact, that old familiarity began to crack. The bombers ahead were flying higher than expected, far higher than the tactical manuals recommended for such missions. Their formation was unnervingly tight, their speed deceptive. Through his gun sight, Sakai could see the dull brown sheen of their fuselages and the strange, almost metallic texture of their skin. He noted these details but dismissed them. Armor, plating, reinforced wings. None of it mattered if you struck the right place with the right shot. At 29,000 feet, his squadron broke formation and began their attack run. Sakai dove from above, the sun at his back, the most advantageous position a fighter could ask for. As he closed the distance, he thumbed the firing switch and let loose a burst from his 20mm cannon. Shells streaked across the gap and hammered into the nearest bomber's fuselage. He expected to see flames bloom from the engines, perhaps an explosion in the fuel tanks. Instead, the bomber shuddered, banked slightly, and kept flying. He adjusted aim and fired again. Another burst, this time into the wing root, where structural integrity was weakest. Nothing, no smoke, no descent, no break in formation. The machine lumbered on as if oblivious to the damage. Over the radio, the calm professionalism of his wingman was fracturing. Direct hits, no effect. One shouted, "My guns are empty, still flying." Another barked, disbelief creeping into his voice. Sakai clenched his teeth and made a third pass, lining up a textbook deflection shot into the bomber's cockpit. He saw glass shatter and metal peel away, but the aircraft remained aloft. Its gunners returned fire with unnerving precision, forcing him to peel away before he could line up a fourth attack. The engagement ended not with the satisfying plume of a falling bomber, but with a quiet, humiliating withdrawal. Fuel was running low, ammunition nearly gone, and not a single enemy plane had been destroyed. The formation, though riddled with hundreds of rounds, continued its mission with the composure of a machine designed to ignore damage. As Sakai's flight limped back to base, the radios remained silent. No one wanted to be the first to admit what they had all just witnessed, that for the first time in their careers, their best efforts had been meaningless. When they landed, the disbelief followed them into the debriefing room. Sakai's gun camera film was reviewed again and again. Every burst, every hit, every frame of footage confirmed the same thing. The bombers had absorbed catastrophic levels of damage and refused to fall. Commanders dismissed the reports at first. They suggested that adrenaline had clouded judgment, that gun calibration had been off, that the pilots had exaggerated under stress. But when other squadrons returned with identical accounts, direct hits with no kills, the narrative began to shift from excuse to alarm. Within weeks, headquarters was flooded with reports from across the Pacific, pilots describing invulnerable bombers that shrugged off damage, that flew with gaping holes in their fuselages, that landed safely despite losing engines. Intelligence officers, initially skeptical, began compiling these accounts into a classified dossier. Technical analysts pored over fragments recovered from downed examples and realized what pilots like Sakai had already understood in their gut. This was not a modified B-17 or B-24. It was something altogether new. The implications were chilling. If the Americans could build bombers that could survive the concentrated fire of Japan's best aces, then interception as a strategy itself might soon become obsolete. Sakai, whose skill had once seemed a weapon in itself, now found that skill rendered nearly irrelevant by an enemy that had chosen to fight not with maneuverability or numbers, but with resilience and endurance. That night, as he walked the darkened airfield and listened to the distant hum of engines returning from patrol, he felt something he had not felt since the first weeks of the war: doubt. The sky, once his domain, was changing, and the enemy had just rewritten the laws of survival. The wreckage lay scattered across the mangrove swamp like the skeleton of some enormous creature, its broken wings jutting up from the earth and its fuselage half submerged in the muddy water. It was the first time Japanese ground crews had gotten close enough to examine one of the new brown bombers that had so thoroughly humiliated their fighter squadrons in the air. The plane had been brought down not by cannon fire. None of the dozens of rounds poured into it during the battle had managed that, but by a freak mechanical failure after its crew bailed out. Now, with the jungle buzzing and the air thick with humidity, engineers and intelligence officers picked through the debris, notebooks in hand, eager to understand what kind of machine could absorb so much punishment and refuse to die. At first glance, it was clearly related to the B-17 flying fortress they already knew, the same general silhouette, the same four-engine layout, the same proud slab-sided fuselage. But the similarities ended there. The first surprise was the armor. Japanese analysts had long believed that American bombers were lightly protected, relying on speed and formation flying rather than heavy plating. Yet here, Beneath torn sheets of aluminum skin, they found dense layers of reinforced armor plating, heavier and thicker than anything they had seen before, encasing the cockpit, the engine nacelles, and the critical control systems. It explained why cannon shells that should have crippled the plane had barely scratched it. Even the fuel lines and oxygen systems had been protected, buried deep within the structure and shielded by multiple layers of metal. Then there were the fuel tanks. To the engineers' astonishment, many of them were intact despite visible signs of direct hits. A closer inspection revealed why. The tanks had been lined with a strange, rubber-like material that swelled and sealed when punctured, preventing catastrophic leaks. Japanese fuel systems, by contrast, were bare metal. A single, well-placed round could turn a zero into a fireball. This new technology, self-sealing fuel tanks, meant that even when the bombers were hit, and they were hit often, they would continue flying long enough to reach their targets or limp home. It was a subtle innovation, but it fundamentally altered the balance of risk in aerial warfare. Even more startling was the gun layout. The old flying fortresses had been formidable enough, but this machine was something else entirely. Gun ports seemed to sprout from every conceivable angle: top, belly, sides, tail, even nose. Some were manned by traditional ball turrets, others by remotely controlled positions linked by intricate systems of cables and gears. The result was a seamless defensive network that covered every approach vector, leaving no blind spots for attackers to exploit. Gun emplacements were reinforced by armor plating and fed by belt-fed ammunition systems designed for sustained fire. For a Zero pilot used to circling behind a bomber and delivering a short, lethal burst, these overlapping fields of fire were deadly. Many of Japan's best aces had been shot down before they ever got within effective range. The recovered wreckage was shipped to Rabaul for further study, where engineers pored over every inch of metal and wiring. The conclusions they drew were unsettling. The Americans had not just improved their bombers, they had fundamentally reimagined them. The B-17, once derided as slow and clumsy, had evolved into something far more sophisticated: a fortress. In the sky, heavily armored, self-sustaining and bristling with teeth. And if intelligence reports were to be believed, this was not even the pinnacle of their capability. Rumors were already filtering in from intercepted communications about an even larger aircraft under development, one with longer range, higher altitude, and heavier payload. They called it the B-29 Superfortress, and it was said to fly higher than any interceptor could reach, delivering destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. For the Japanese High Command, the implications were sobering. The entire philosophy of air defense, built on the assumption that bombers could be intercepted and destroyed before reaching their targets, was being undermined by technology. No longer were bombers mere targets lumbering toward their doom. They were now weapon systems in their own right, capable of defending themselves and surviving damage that would have annihilated previous generations of aircraft. If the B-17 represented a shift in thinking, the coming B-29 threatened to render entire categories of Japanese weaponry and tactics obsolete. Pilots who had once sneered at American bombers now spoke of them with grudging respect, even fear. Engineers quietly admitted that Japan lacked the industrial base to produce anything comparable. And strategists, once confident in their layered defenses, began to speak in whispers of what might happen if these bombers reached the home islands. Unopposed, the wreckage from that swamp had revealed more than the structure of a single airplane. It was a glimpse into the future, one where air power would be determined not by pilot skill or tactical cunning, but by engineering, production, and the relentless logic of industrial might. The era of the fragile bomber was over. What was coming would change the war itself. By the winter of 1943, the struggle for control of the Pacific skies had taken on a strange and frustrating new dimension. It was no longer simply a contest of maneuver and marksmanship, of who could outturn or outshoot the other. It was becoming a battle fought in an invisible realm, a realm of altitude where the laws of physics themselves seemed to favor one side. The new American bombers did not just fly higher than their predecessors. They operated in a domain the Japanese had never prepared to fight in. Above 30,000 feet, where the air thinned to the point that even breathing required oxygen masks and engines gasped for power, these brown planes cruised as if the stratosphere belonged to them. For Japanese pilots, the experience was disorienting and humiliating. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. Agile, deadly, and efficient, it had dominated the early Pacific campaigns with its unmatched maneuverability and climb rate. But it had been designed for a different kind of war. Its radial engine performed admirably below 20,000 feet, where most aerial engagements had taken place until then. Above 25,000 feet, however, its power began to fade. By 28,000, the Zero struggled to gain even a few hundred more feet of altitude. At 30,000, it was often near its operational ceiling. And that was precisely where the Americans now chose to fight. It was not just the altitude itself that presented a problem. The thin air at those heights robbed engines of oxygen, reducing power output and making sustained climbs painfully slow. Control surfaces became sluggish, robbing the Zero of its famed agility. Even simple turns required more effort, and the slightest mistake could send a plane into an uncontrollable stall. Meanwhile, the bombers, equipped with supercharged engines and pressurized cabins, seemed unaffected. They cruised steadily at altitudes the Japanese fighters could barely reach, their formations drifting serenely through the upper atmosphere like a fleet of airborne leviathans. For the pilots, below, the experience was maddening. Missions often began with a desperate vertical chase, engines howling as they clawed their way toward the bomber's altitude, only for them to arrive exhausted, with little speed or maneuverability left for an attack. Even then, they frequently found themselves just short of the necessary height, watching helplessly as the brown silhouettes glided past above them, out of range of their guns. Interception missions became less about combat and more about frustration, about chasing ghosts that could not be caught. Veteran ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa described the sensation in his logbook after one such mission over Truk. "We climbed until the air thinned and the engine groaned," he wrote. "The bombers were still above us, calm and indifferent. We fired from too far away, our shells arcing uselessly into the empty sky. It was like trying to fight a mountain." The altitude advantage changed everything about how the Americans conducted their bombing campaigns. No longer forced to fly at vulnerable altitudes where anti-aircraft guns and fighters could easily reach them, they now operated beyond the effective reach of most Japanese defenses. The gunners stationed around major cities found their shells, bursting harmlessly thousands of feet below the bomber streams. Fighter squadrons were scrambled more often than ever, yet more and more often they returned without having even fired a shot. The simple act of climbing, something so fundamental to aerial warfare, had become a barrier Japan could not reliably overcome. Efforts were made to solve the problem. Engineers tried fitting the Zero with more powerful engines and even experimented with rocket-assisted climbs, but Japan's limited industrial capacity made widespread implementation impossible. New fighter designs were proposed, some capable of reaching the necessary altitudes, but they would not enter service until it was far too late. The reality was that the Americans had exploited a technological gap that Japan could not close. They had turned altitude itself into a weapon, one that required no bullets, no dogfights, and no direct confrontation to wield. Pilots who had once prided themselves on their skill and courage now felt helpless. They were trained to engage the enemy face to face, to test themselves in close-range duels of reflex and instinct. But how do you fight an enemy who stays beyond your reach? How do you defeat a machine that refuses to come down to where you can meet it? The old rituals of aerial combat, the spiraling dives, the daring head-on passes, the decisive bursts of cannon fire, meant nothing against an enemy content to rain destruction from a realm you could not enter. By the time the first reports of even larger, higher-flying bombers, the B-29 superfortresses, began circulating, a grim understanding had settled over the fighter squadrons. The age of the dogfight was slipping away. In its place was something colder, more impersonal, and far more deadly. The Americans had found a way to wage war, not by outflying their opponents, but by simply flying where their opponents could not follow. Altitude, once a mere tactical consideration, had become a decisive weapon, and in that thin, unreachable air, the balance of the Pacific War was shifting irrevocably. At first, no one believed the reports. Radar operators insisted their instruments were not malfunctioning, that the strange readings were real. But commanders dismissed the idea as impossible. Bombers, by their very nature, were supposed to be slower than fighters. It was a fundamental assumption of aerial warfare. Nimble interceptors hunted lumbering bombers. Yet by late 1943, that assumption was beginning to crumble. The new American aircraft were not just flying higher, they were moving faster, and not in short bursts or shallow dives, but in sustained, level flight. Reconnaissance pilots tracking. Their routes reported speeds that defied everything Japanese intelligence had on American bomber capabilities. What had once been considered an easy catch had become a race that the hunters were losing. The first real evidence came from a mission over the Bismarck Sea. A formation of brown bombers was sighted approaching from the southeast, and 3 Zero squadrons were scrambled from Rabaul to intercept. The plan was standard: climb ahead of the formation, position for a frontal assault, and then break it apart with coordinated passes. But as the interceptors climbed and leveled off, something was wrong. The bombers weren't where they were supposed to be. They were farther ahead, much farther, and still gaining ground. The fighters pushed their throttles forward engines, screaming as they tried to close the distance. Yet for every kilometer they gained, the bombers gained too. By the time the Zeros reached their maximum speed, the enemy aircraft were already fading into the horizon, their contrails like thin white scars across the blue. It became a pattern repeated across the Pacific. Fighter wings would scramble, fuel tanks heavy and guns loaded, only to spend the next hour chasing targets that seemed to slip effortlessly away. Missions often ended not with triumphant radio calls, but with frustrated silence as pilots turned back, low on fuel and no closer to their quarry than when they'd started. Even when interceptors managed to catch sight of the bombers, it was often too late. The Americans would already be well past their intended targets, bombs dropped, formation turning for home, leaving Japanese fighters darting helplessly in their wake. The implications were devastating. Entire squadrons were burning. Through precious aviation fuel, a resource Japan could ill afford to waste, without inflicting a single casualty. Air defense commanders began questioning the very point of scrambling interceptors at all. If the bombers could not be caught, if they could deliver their payloads and vanish before a single shot was fired, what good were fighters? The frustration ate at the morale of even the most seasoned pilots. Men who had built their reputations on speed and precision now felt as though they were flying obsolete relics, chasing ghosts that refused to be caught. Technical officers soon confirmed what the pilots already knew in their bones. The new bombers were equipped with turbo-supercharged engines that allowed them to maintain high power output even at altitude, giving them a level of speed and endurance previously unimaginable for an aircraft of their size. In level flight, many of them could sustain speeds close to 350 miles per hour, faster than most Japanese fighters could maintain for any significant distance. And while the Zero was still technically capable of higher top speeds in a dive, it could not sustain them, nor could it maintain such speeds while climbing to bomber altitude. The result was a cruel paradox. The hunters could not reach the prey until it was already gone. Pilots tried everything to adapt. They launched earlier, hoping to cut off the bombers before they reached their targets. They attempted head-on intercepts, diving from high altitude to build speed in the final moments. They experimented with climbing patrols and ambush tactics. But time and again, the results were the same. The Americans simply cruised past the kill zone and vanished into the distance, untouchable and indifferent. "We flew until the needles trembled in the red," one veteran pilot wrote in his diary, "and still they grew smaller ahead of us." In the ready rooms, the talk turned bitter. Some pilots began comparing the bombers to trains, not because of their bulk, but because of the relentless, unstoppable way they seemed to move, unbothered by pursuit. Others called them phantoms, not because they were invisible, but because they behaved like something unreal, beyond the limits of physics as they understood it. By early 1944, Japanese commanders were facing an uncomfortable truth. The air war had become a battle they could no longer control. Their fighters were outmatched not just by altitude and armor, but now by sheer speed. The bombers were rewriting the rules of engagement, dictating when and where battles would occur and whether they would occur at all. And for the first time in the Pacific, the Imperial Air Arm found itself fighting on terms it had not chosen. A fight it could not win, against enemies it could no longer catch. The sky, once a place where courage and skill determined victory, had become a proving ground for technology. And technology was leaving Japan behind. The scattered reports, at first dismissed as exaggerations, began to pile up on the desks of intelligence officers in Tokyo and Rabaul. They came from pilots, radar operators, ground crews, and captured prisoners. Fragments of observation, and rumor that, when assembled, painted a deeply unsettling picture. The new bombers were not merely aircraft. They were products of an industrial system operating on a scale Japan could scarcely comprehend. Every part of their design, from the alloys in their frames to the engines that roared them into the thin reaches of the sky, spoke of a nation that had fused science, engineering, and manufacturing into a single war-making machine. The United States, they realized, was not just fighting the war with planes and bombs, it was fighting it with factories. One of the first breakthroughs came when engineers studied fragments of wreckage retrieved from a crash site in Bougainville. The material was unlike anything they were accustomed to working with. It was a lightweight, corrosion-resistant aluminum alloy produced in quantities large enough to clad hundreds of bombers. Japan's aircraft industry, by contrast, still relied heavily on older methods and limited supplies of strategic metals. Their planes were light and nimble because they had to be, stripped of heavy armor and protection to compensate for material shortages. The Americans, with their vast reserves of bauxite and their sprawling industrial base, faced no such constraints. They could build aircraft that were both durable and powerful without compromising speed or payload. Even more alarming were the engine components. When captured examples of the bombers' power plants were examined, Japanese engineers found sophisticated turbo superchargers, complex devices that forced compressed air into the engines, allowing them to maintain power at altitudes where conventional engines would suffocate. It was a leap in engineering that Japan had only begun to experiment with, and on a scale that was unimaginable given its limited industrial capacity. These devices were not rare prototypes or special modifications. They were standard equipment on every bomber rolling off the assembly line. The implications were devastating. American aircraft could fly faster, higher and farther than anything Japan could field, not because their pilots were better, but because their factories were. The surprises did not end there. Reports from captured aircrew and intercepted manuals revealed that many of these bombers were equipped with pressurized cabins, a revolutionary feature that allowed crews to operate comfortably and effectively at altitudes that left Japanese pilots gasping for breath. This, too, was a product of industrial sophistication. Designing and building pressurized systems required advanced metallurgy, precision machining, and extensive testing, all of which demanded a level of infrastructure that Japan, with its bombed-out factories and resource shortages, could not hope to match. The intelligence summaries that landed on the desks of senior commanders read like a litany of inadequacy. Every component of the American bomber represented not just a technological edge, but an entire ecosystem of industry behind it. Japan could build an engine. America could build tens of thousands, each more powerful than the last. Japan could forge a handful of aircraft frames. America could pour rivers of molten aluminum into sprawling assembly lines that produced bombers. Like clockwork, Japan's few experimental pressurization projects were hand-built and temperamental. America's were mass-produced and flawless. What unsettled the analysts most was the realization that the bombers themselves were only one part of a much larger system. Behind each aircraft stood networks of suppliers, foundries, and railways. Behind every sortie was an army of engineers, machinists, and factory workers. Entire cities had been repurposed to build the machines that now ruled the skies. And even as Japan struggled to replace the losses from each month's fighting, America's output continued to rise. By 1944, new bombers were rolling off assembly, lines faster than Japan could shoot them down. The contrast between the two nations could not have been starker. Japan had entered the war believing that superior training, discipline, and fighting spirit could compensate for material disadvantages. But as the war ground on, it became clear that no amount of skill could make up for the overwhelming power of American industry. It was not just a matter of numbers, though those alone were staggering, but of innovation, standardization, and efficiency on a scale that defied imagination. The enemy had transformed its economy into a weapon, and the bombers that darkened Japan's skies were its sharpest blade. In quiet moments, some intelligence officers admitted what they could not say publicly, that the war might already be lost, not on the battlefield, but in the foundries of Detroit and the assembly lines of Seattle. Pilots could train harder, tactics could be refined, and weapons could be improved, but none of that would change the fact that Japan was fighting an opponent that could outbuild, out-engineer, and outproduce it by orders of magnitude. The new bombers were not just machines of war. They were the embodiment of a nation's industrial will, a flying demonstration of what a modern economy could achieve when turned entirely toward destruction. And from that moment onward, every Japanese officer who read those reports understood that the battle for the skies was no longer just about airplanes. It was about factories, and Japan's were losing. By the spring of 1944, the strategies that had once defined Japan's air defense looked like relics from another era. For years, the Imperial military had based its doctrine on a simple premise. Enemy bombers would approach at medium altitude. Where anti-aircraft fire was effective, an interceptor aircraft could engage them directly. That assumption had held true in China and the early Pacific campaigns, when B-17s and B-24s lumbered across the skies at heights well within reach of flak batteries and nimble Zero fighters. But the arrival of the new American bombers, flying, higher, faster, and more heavily armed, shattered those assumptions overnight. The meticulously prepared defenses of the home islands, once considered sufficient to protect the nation's cities and industrial heartlands, were suddenly obsolete. The first sign of how dramatically the balance had shifted came during an air raid over Yawata in June 1944. Radar stations detected incoming aircraft hours before they arrived, but the tracks made little sense. The altitudes were far higher than expected, the speed far greater. Anti-aircraft crews readied their batteries as they had always done. But when the bombers finally came into view, their shells burst hundreds of meters below the formation. The gunners adjusted their calculations, increased their elevation, and tried again, still too low. The enemy was flying well above the effective ceiling of most Japanese flak guns, rendering them nearly useless. Even the few heavy batteries, capable of reaching such heights, lacked the sophisticated fire control systems needed to target aircraft moving so quickly and at such distances. What had once been a formidable defensive network was reduced to a display of impotent explosions beneath the bomber streams. The fighter squadrons fared no better. Pilots scrambled from airfields around Kyushu, determined to intercept the invaders before they reached their targets. But by the time they climbed to altitude, the Americans were already overhead, their bombs falling in precise patterns on steel mills, refineries, and shipyards. Even when the Zeros managed to make contact, the engagements were brief and one-sided. The bombers' turrets spat streams of .50 caliber fire into the thin air, driving attackers back before they could get within effective range. The few hits that did land were absorbed by armor plating or sealed by self-healing fuel tanks. Most of the interceptors returned to base empty-handed, having expended precious fuel and ammunition to no effect. In command centers across the home islands, officers stared grimly at situation maps covered with new red markers, industrial sites hit, transportation networks severed, communications hubs destroyed. The bombers had not only penetrated Japan's defenses, they had done so with alarming ease. Cities once believed to be beyond the range of enemy attack were now within striking distance. Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, all had been considered relatively secure due to their distance from Allied bases. Now nothing seemed safe. The very geography of Japan, once thought to be a natural shield, had been rendered meaningless by an enemy that could cross oceans, climb into the stratosphere, and deliver destruction from unreachable heights. Efforts to adapt came too late and achieved too little. Engineers scrambled to design new anti-aircraft guns with greater range and improved targeting systems. But Japan's industrial shortages meant few could be built in significant numbers. Attempts to develop faster interceptors faltered amid material scarcity and logistical chaos. Radar, too, lagged behind. Japan's early warning network, based on technology several years behind that of the Allies, struggled to track bomber formations accurately at high altitudes and long distances. By the time signals were decoded and commands issued, the Americans had already struck and withdrawn. The psychological impact of this shift was as devastating as the physical damage. Civilians who had once believed themselves far from the front lines now listened in terror for the distant drone of engines in the night. The glow of fires on the horizon became a familiar sight, and the shriek of air raid sirens marked the new rhythm of daily life. Propaganda broadcasts urged calm, insisting that Japan's defenses remained strong, but the evidence in the skies told a different story. The once proud notion that the home islands were invulnerable was crumbling under the weight of reality. Strategists in Tokyo wrestled with an uncomfortable truth. The war had outgrown their doctrines. Their entire defensive strategy, the positioning of anti-aircraft batteries, the deployment of interceptor wings, even the timing of civilian evacuation drills, had been built around assumptions that no longer applied. The Americans had redefined the parameters of aerial warfare, and Japan was struggling to catch up. What had once been a fortress nation was now exposed on every front, its skies pierced by weapons it could not counter. By the time the first rumors of an even more advanced bomber, the B-29 superfortress, reached Japan, the writing was already on the wall. The enemy's air power was no longer a nuisance to be contained. It was a force of nature, reshaping the very landscape of war. Japan's defenses, conceived for a different age and a different enemy, were now little more than ceremonial gestures, against a storm that no wall of steel or courage could stop. The skies that once belonged to Japan now belonged to the machines that no gun could reach and no fighter could catch. And from those skies, the destruction was only just beginning. The classrooms smelled of oil and chalk dust. The hangars echoed with the shouts of instructors, and the skies above Japan filled with the drone of training flights that now felt strangely hollow. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army, Air forces were training pilots for a war they were no longer equipped to fight. Every lesson, every maneuver, every carefully memorized tactic was aimed at solving a problem that was already beyond their reach. The Americans had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare, and Japan's flight schools were racing to catch up to an enemy that was always several steps ahead. The curriculum shifted almost overnight. Gone were the days when cadets practiced elegant, turning battles or head-on passes against slow, predictable bombers. Now every drill focused on altitude and speed, the two factors that defined the new enemy threat. Young pilots spent hours rehearsing steep climbs that strained their aircraft and their bodies, learning to push their machines to the edge of their performance envelopes. They practiced vertical dives from high altitude, trying to build enough speed to intercept fast-moving targets before they slipped beyond reach. On the blackboards, instructors sketched formation diagrams of the new bomber streams, describing patterns and profiles that many trainees had never actually seen with their own eyes. The enemy was so high, so fast, so distant, that for many of these young men, the first time they would see an American bomber would be the day they tried, and likely failed, to shoot it down. But even these new lessons were already outdated. The tactics they practiced relied on assumptions that no longer held true. They required interceptors to reach the bombers before they dropped their payloads, but the Zero and its successors could barely climb to the necessary altitude before running low on fuel. They assumed that a well-coordinated attack could break bomber formations, but the dense web of defensive fire from the new aircraft shredded attackers before they ever reached firing range. They taught precision marksmanship and engine targeting techniques, but the enemy's armor and self-sealing tanks rendered many of those shots useless. By the time a cadet graduated and entered combat, most of what he had learned was obsolete. The problem was not simply one of technology, though the gap there was enormous, but of time. Japan's pilots were being prepared for a type of aerial combat that had already passed into history. The Americans were no longer fighting the same war that Japan's airmen had been trained to wage, where Japanese doctrine still emphasized individual skill and the glory of close-quarters dogfighting. The United States had embraced an industrialized, mechanized form of air war. Its bombers were not opponents to be outflown, they were systems to be overwhelmed, and Japan had neither the tools nor the numbers to do so. Instructors knew this, even if they rarely said it aloud. They saw the despair in the eyes of their students when they described bomber altitudes above 30,000 feet or speeds that rivaled their fastest fighters. They heard the whispered questions in the barracks at night. How do you fight what you cannot reach? How do you shoot what you cannot catch? Yet the training continued because there was nothing else to do. Japan needed pilots. Even if those pilots were destined to fail, some officers proposed radical new approaches, rocket-assisted takeoffs, high-altitude ambushes, or massed kamikaze attacks designed to crash directly into bomber formations. A few of these ideas were tested but most proved impractical or suicidal. Others called for the development of entirely new aircraft, faster, more powerful interceptors capable of matching the bomber's performance. But Japan's industry, already stretched beyond its limits, could not produce such planes in sufficient numbers before the war's tide swept them away. By the time many young pilots graduated, the situation at the front had become so dire that they were rushed into combat with only a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. Some barely knew how to use their oxygen systems. Others had never practiced firing at high-altitude targets. Many never even saw the bombers they were supposed to stop. Their missions ended before they climbed high enough to make visual contact. Those who did reach them often found themselves chasing aircraft that climbed away effortlessly, their formation shrinking into the distance while fuel gauges sank toward empty. In a cruel irony, the Japanese training program, once one of the most rigorous in the world, had become a symbol of how far behind the nation had fallen. The lessons continued, the drills persisted, the chalkboards filled with diagrams and equations, but the war they were preparing for no longer existed. The enemy had evolved beyond their reach, and no amount of discipline or determination could close the gap. As one veteran instructor put it in a letter to his family late in the war, "We are training boys to climb ladders while the enemy builds towers. They will climb bravely, perhaps even heroically, but they will never reach the top." It was a quiet acknowledgement of what many in the Japanese air service already knew, that their fight in the sky was no longer a battle for victory, but a desperate attempt to delay defeat. The night began with a strange hum, faint at first, like distant thunder rolling across the Kanto plain. It was just past midnight on March 9, 1945, and most of Tokyo's residents, exhausted from long workdays and nightly blackouts, were asleep when the sound reached them. They had heard the air raid sirens before. They had seen bombs fall, fires burn, and streets reduced to rubble, but this night was different. The hum grew deeper, heavier, more continuous, until it seemed to fill the air itself. Those who stepped outside looked up into a cloudless sky and saw what seemed to be an impossible sight. Not a handful of bombers, but hundreds of them. A vast procession of dark, slow-moving shapes stretching from horizon to horizon. Witnesses would later recall that they did not look like planes at all. They looked like moving factories, immense, deliberate and unstoppable, drifting silently over the sleeping city. This was Operation Meeting House, the largest single air raid of the Second World War. More than 300 B-29 superfortresses. The brown planes that Japanese pilots had learned to fear and civilians had come to dread, had launched from bases in the Mariana Islands on a mission unlike any before. Their target was not a military base or an industrial complex. It was Tokyo itself, the beating heart of Japan's empire, a city of nearly 7 million people. Their cargo was not high-explosive bombs, but something far more devastating, clusters of incendiary canisters designed to ignite the wooden houses and paper walls that made up the city's neighborhoods. At 12:08 a.m., the first wave reached the city and began its work. Hatches opened, and thousands of M69 incendiaries tumbled into the night, spinning through the darkness before, bursting into showers of flaming jelly that clung to everything it touched. Within minutes, dozens of small fires were burning across the eastern wards. Within an hour, those fires had merged into an inferno. The flames spread faster than anyone could comprehend, leaping from roof to roof, racing down alleys and devouring entire blocks in minutes. The oxygen in the air grew so scarce that those who survived later described it as trying to breathe inside a furnace. The city's firefighting services were overwhelmed almost instantly. Water pressure failed as mains ruptured under the intense heat. Fire engines melted before they could even approach the flames. Entire neighborhoods vanished in an orange glow as the conflagration generated winds strong enough to knock people off their feet. Survivors spoke of fire tornadoes, swirling columns of flame that tore through the streets, sucking people, animals, and debris into their spinning cores. Those who fled to the rivers for safety found the water boiling around them. Those who sought refuge in basements or air raid shelters suffocated as the flames consumed all available oxygen. Above it all, the B-29s continued their slow, deliberate circuits, dropping wave after wave of incendiaries with mechanical precision. Anti-aircraft fire, already ineffective at such altitudes, was almost non-existent. The few Japanese fighters that managed to scramble never reached the bombers' altitude before running out of fuel. It was as if the bombers existed in another world entirely. Beyond reach, beyond resistance, their destruction as inevitable as the rising sun. One survivor would later write, "They did not seem like planes. They were machines that had come to erase us, and nothing we did could stop them." By dawn, Tokyo was no longer a city. It was a landscape of smoldering ruins stretching as far as the eye could see. Nearly 16 square miles had been reduced to ash. More than 100,000 people were dead, most of them civilians, and more than 1 million were homeless. Entire districts had ceased to exist, their names preserved only in official records, and the memories of those who once lived there. The heat from the fires had been so intense that steel rails had melted and rivers had boiled. Even seasoned war correspondents who had witnessed the bombing of cities in Europe were stunned by the scale of the devastation. What shocked the Japanese leadership most was not just the destruction itself, but the way it had been carried out. The raid had not been a desperate gamble or a singular feat of courage. It had been an operation, planned, executed, and completed with cold industrial efficiency. The bombers had come, done their work, and returned to their bases thousands of miles away without significant losses. It was destruction on a scale once unimaginable, delivered as casually as a factory fulfilling an order. For the people of Tokyo, that night marked the moment when hope began to die. If their capital, the symbol of their nation's strength and spirit, could be turned into a sea of fire in a matter of hours, what chance did the rest of Japan have? The realization was as searing as the flames themselves. The enemy now possessed not just the means to wage war, but the capacity to erase entire cities at will. And the brown plains, which had once seemed merely invincible, now appeared as something even more terrifying. Engines of annihilation whose power no human courage could match. By the spring of 1945, Japan's struggle in the skies had entered a phase that no one had imagined in the early days of the war. The elite fighter corps that once prided itself on daring skill and tactical superiority had been reduced to a grim calculus. If precision attacks and traditional interceptions could not stop the new American bombers, perhaps desperation could. And so, for the first time, kamikaze units, once the domain of naval aviators tasked with crashing into enemy ships, were now formed with a new and nearly impossible mission. Their targets were not warships or carriers at sea. They were the brown plains that roamed the skies, the vast formations of B-29s that seemed beyond the reach of reason, technology, or even death itself. The orders were simple, but brutal. Pilots were to climb as high as possible, wait for the bombers to pass overhead, and then dive directly into them. The hope was that even if a single bomber could be destroyed this way, even if just one was brought down before it dropped its deadly payload, the sacrifice might save a few hundred lives on the ground. But hope, like fuel, was in short supply. The challenges that had defeated conventional interception tactics, altitude, speed, armor, remained unchanged. The Zero, already struggling to reach the bomber's cruising altitude, became almost uncontrollable when loaded with the additional weight of explosives. Pilots who managed to climb that high often arrived exhausted, their oxygen supplies depleted, their visibility clouded by frost on their canopies. Even when they did reach the Bombers, the results were often devastatingly anticlimactic. A kamikaze attack required precision, a perfect alignment, a steady approach, and nerves of steel. But the bombers' defensive fire made such precision nearly impossible. Gunners opened up long before the Japanese planes came close, filling the thin air with walls of tracer fire. Many kamikaze pilots were shredded before they could even begin their final dive. Others were crippled by hits to their engines or control surfaces, sending them spiraling helplessly away. And those who did make it through often found their attacks thwarted by the sheer durability of the enemy. There were reports of kamikaze planes colliding with bombers, only to see the American aircraft continue flying, wounded, but still part of the formation, while the Japanese pilot disintegrated into the sky. The psychological toll on the men assigned to these missions was immense. They were not naive about their odds. Most knew they would die without ever seeing the enemy up close, and those who survived their first attempts returned to base with haunted eyes, speaking little and volunteering again despite the futility of it all. For many, these missions were not acts of patriotism or vengeance, but gestures of resignation, last-ditch efforts to matter in a war that no longer seemed winnable. "We go because there is nothing else we can do," one pilot wrote in a final letter to his family. "If our lives cannot change the outcome, perhaps our deaths will buy Japan one more day." Commanders knew the strategy was not working, but they had few alternatives. Aircraft production had plummeted under relentless bombing, fuel supplies were dwindling, and experienced pilots were irreplaceable. What remained of Japan's air power was scattered, fragmented, and demoralized. Kamikaze units, for all their inefficiency, at least offered the illusion of resistance. A statement to the Japanese people and to the world that their nation would not surrender quietly. But illusions did little to stop the destruction. The Americans, for their part, adapted quickly. Bomber formations flew tighter and denser, overlapping their fields of fire to create impenetrable shields of lead. Escort fighters, equipped with superior range and altitude performance, prowled the edges of the bomber streams, intercepting kamikaze planes before they could climb into position. The already steep odds for a successful attack plummeted even further, and yet the missions continued. Hundreds of pilots launched into the freezing upper atmosphere knowing they would never return. From the ground, civilians watched the streaks of desperate climbs rise into the night sky, thin trails of vapor chasing distant contrails that never seemed to grow closer. They cheered the bravery of the men above, but many also sensed the truth. This was not courage that could change the course of war. It was courage expended against inevitability. The bombers kept coming night after night, their formations as steady as the tides, their destruction as predictable as dawn. By mid-1945, Japanese commanders no longer spoke of defeating the bombers. They spoke, instead of delaying them, of forcing them to expend more fuel, of disrupting their formation just enough to buy time for evacuations or repairs. The air war had become one of diminishing returns, every sortie a gamble with almost certain failure. The once proud defenders of Japan's skies now found themselves sacrificing everything for the smallest of victories, and even those were rare. The kamikaze pilots did not stop the bombers. They did not slow the pace of destruction. But their missions revealed something deeper about the state of Japan's war effort, that it had crossed a threshold where survival itself was measured not in victories, but in gestures of defiance. Each futile dive was an act of mourning as much as resistance, a final, desperate attempt to touch the untouchable, and a grim acknowledgement that even the ultimate sacrifice could no longer change the outcome written high above in the contrails of unstoppable machines. The men who had once been the pride of the Imperial Navy Air Service now sat in silence in the ready rooms, their flight suits smelling faintly of oil and sweat, their eyes fixed on the floor. These were not raw recruits or hastily trained conscripts. They were veterans, aces with dozens of victories carved into the fuselages of their aircraft, men who had once believed themselves the embodiment of Japan's warrior spirit. They had fought in the skies above China, over the jungles of Burma, and across the wide expanse of the Pacific. They had outmaneuvered American Wildcats, outflown British Spitfires, and written their names into the history of aerial combat. But by 1945, those same men no longer spoke with the confidence of hunters. They spoke, if they spoke at all, like men watching a battle. They no longer had the power to influence. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual erosion, a slow, humiliating realization that their skill, once the decisive factor in every engagement, had been rendered meaningless by forces beyond their control. Dogfighting had always been a contest of reflexes and instincts, of precision flying and nerves of steel. Victory went to the pilot who could outthink, outturn, or outshoot his opponent in a swirling ballet of speed and chaos. But the war above, Japan had changed. The enemy no longer engaged in that kind of fight. They did not swoop and roll and clash in furious duels above the clouds. They flew in vast formations, higher than the Zero could climb, faster than the interceptors could chase, their wings bristling with defensive guns and their fuselages shrugging off damage that would have destroyed any Japanese aircraft. For men who had defined their lives by mastery of the skies, the shift was existential. It was as if a swordsman, honed by decades of training, suddenly found himself facing an armored train. No matter how skilled his blade, it was irrelevant against a force that did not fight by his rules. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, an ace with 42 confirmed kills, described the feeling after one failed interception. "We circled beneath them like children throwing stones at the moon. All our training, all our experience, useless. We were not pilots anymore. We were witnesses. The missions themselves became rituals of futility. Veterans, who once thrilled at the chase, now spent hours staring at contrails that receded faster than they could close the distance. Those rare moments when they did reach the bomber formations often ended in disaster. A carefully calculated firing pass would be met with a hail of machine gun fire from dozens of defensive positions. Precision gunnery meant little against armor plating. Even the most accurate bursts, the kind that once sent enemy planes spiraling into the sea, barely registered as scratches on the bombers' thick hides. And when the formations turned for home, their bombs dropped and their objectives accomplished. There was nothing the Japanese pilots could do but follow them with their eyes until they disappeared over the horizon. The psychological weight of that helplessness was crushing. The veterans who had once lectured younger pilots on the supremacy of skill now struggled to find words of encouragement. Many turned inward, flying their missions with grim resignation rather than the fierce pride that had once defined their service. They still climbed into their cockpits, still took off when the sirens wailed, still engaged when the enemy appeared. But deep down, they knew their efforts were gestures rather than actions, protests rather than strategies. "We fought with courage," one pilot wrote in his diary. But courage had no weight against steel and altitude. Some tried to adapt, developing new tactics or experimenting with unconventional attack patterns. They practiced coordinated approaches, attempted simultaneous strikes from multiple angles, and even considered ramming attacks. But the bombers remained largely untouchable. The gulf between man and machine, between skill and technology, was simply too wide. What had once been a duel between equals had become an execution carried out from beyond the reach of their weapons. In the quiet moments between sorties, the pilots spoke of their past victories with a kind of wistful disbelief, as though those days had belonged to another life. They recalled the early years of the war, when the Zero's agility made them kings of the air, when the mere sight of their silhouettes was enough to scatter enemy formations. Now the tables had turned so completely that they felt more like spectators than participants, their once feared presence barely acknowledged by the bombers that passed overhead. What stung most of all was the knowledge that their defeat was not the result of cowardice or incompetence, but of obsolescence. They had not become worse pilots. The enemy had simply built machines that rendered their skills irrelevant. The realization was almost unbearable. The very identity of the Japanese fighter pilot, once defined by dominance, mastery, and unshakable confidence, had been hollowed out, leaving behind only the bitter truth that bravery alone could not overcome industrial power. And so the veterans who had once ruled the Pacific skies continued to fly, not because they believed they could win, but because flying was all they had left. They were no longer warriors shaping the outcome of battles. They were witnesses to the death of an era, powerless to stop the storm that roared above them. The revelation did not come from the sky, but from the interrogation rooms, the debriefing tables, and the captured manuals spread open under dim light in military intelligence offices. Japanese officers had long suspected that the new American bombers represented a leap forward in design and engineering, but what they were beginning to understand went far deeper than that. These machines were not simply individual feats of aeronautical brilliance. They were the visible tips of an enormous industrial iceberg, the end products of a system so vast and coordinated that it dwarfed anything Japan could imagine. The B-29s that roared over their cities were not standalone marvels of technology. They were symbols, flying embodiments of an entire nation's economy, science, and logistics working in perfect synchronization. Prisoners of war, captured after bailing out of downed bombers or crash-landing in occupied territory, spoke with a kind of casual certainty about things that left their interrogators stunned. They talked about production quotas, measured not in dozens or hundreds, but in thousands. They described assembly lines that stretched for miles through factories employing tens of thousands of workers. They spoke of specialized plants where wings, fuselages, and engines were produced separately before being shipped to final assembly sites, where a completed bomber could roll out every single day. One captured crewman mentioned almost offhandedly that the bomber he had flown was one of more than 3,000 built in a single year, a figure that left his interrogators speechless. Japan's most ambitious production goals for a single aircraft type rarely exceeded a fraction of that number. Further intelligence painted an even more daunting picture. Behind each bomber was an intricate web of suppliers, steel mills, aluminum smelters, electronics manufacturers, rubber plants, and fuel refineries, all coordinated with clockwork precision. Trains and cargo ships delivered parts and materials from every corner of the United States to massive plants in Seattle, Wichita, and Marietta. Government contracts ensured that civilian companies devoted their full capacity to the war effort, while scientific research institutions worked hand in hand with industry to solve engineering problems that would have seemed insurmountable elsewhere. The bombers were not just built, they were cultivated, the product of a national machine that had transformed the act of war into an exercise in industrial planning. What shocked Japanese analysts most was the scale and efficiency of it all. A single American plant could produce more aircraft in a month than some of Japan's facilities produced in a year. Where Japanese engineers hand-fitted components and relied on skilled craftsmen to complete critical tasks, American factories used automated machinery and standardized parts that allowed thousands of workers, many of them with little technical training, to build complex bombers at astonishing speed. And when a design flaw was discovered, production did not halt. Engineering teams revised blueprints while assembly continued, ensuring that improvements were incorporated almost immediately into later models. It was a level of adaptability that Japan's more artisanal approach to manufacturing could not hope to match. The same logic extended beyond the production floor. Logistics networks ensured that completed bombers were fueled, armed, and maintained with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. Spare parts followed the planes wherever they went, delivered by convoys of trucks and fleets of cargo ships. Airfields on distant islands were equipped with specialized maintenance depots capable of overhauling engines and replacing damaged components on site. Supply chains stretched across the Pacific like arteries, pumping the lifeblood of industry into every corner of the Allied war effort. Japan, struggling to ship even basic supplies to its scattered outposts, could only watch in disbelief. Perhaps the most sobering realization came from the scientific dimension of the program. Many of the technologies that made the new bombers so formidable, their turbo superchargers, pressurized cabins, and advanced navigation systems, were not the work of isolated inventors, but the result of coordinated research efforts involving universities, government laboratories, and private companies. American science was not operating in silos. It was a coordinated arm of the war machine, feeding innovations directly into production lines. The bombers represented not just industrial strength, but intellectual power, a fusion of research, engineering, and manufacturing that operated on a scale Japan could not replicate. For the officers reviewing these reports, the conclusion was inescapable. They were not fighting against airplanes. They were fighting against an entire system, one that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them, innovate faster than Japan could respond, and scale its operations beyond anything the empire's limited resources could sustain. Each bomber that appeared over Tokyo or Osaka was more than a machine of war. It was a message. It spoke of an enemy that had transformed its entire society into a production engine, one capable of projecting power across oceans and sustaining it indefinitely. The realization cast a long shadow over Japan's remaining war plans. No matter how brave its pilots, how cunning its tactics, or how determined its people, there was no single battle or decisive strike that could dismantle the industrial colossus behind the bombers. The factories that built them were as much a weapon as the planes themselves, and they were weapons Japan had no means of striking back against. For the first time, many within the military began to whisper what had once been unthinkable, that the war might already be unwinnable, not because of failures on the battlefield, but because of a force that no amount of courage could defeat. The relentless, unstoppable machinery of American industry. By the summer of 1945, the reality of Japan's defeat was no longer confined to briefing rooms or flight decks. It was written across the skies, traced in the contrails of the endless streams of B-29s that crossed the Pacific and burned into the ground by the infernos they left behind. Every morning, civilians in Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and countless other cities awoke to the same sound. The low, distant rumble of engines that heralded another day of destruction. What had once been rare and terrifying, a bombing raid, was now a routine part of life. Sirens wailed almost daily, sending families scrambling to shelters they knew could not protect them. Factories stopped and started according to the rhythm of the bombers' approach. Even the most patriotic slogans about sacrifice and perseverance could not drown out the unmistakable truth. Japan was being dismantled from the air, piece by piece. The scale of the destruction defied comprehension. The B-29s did not target individual factories or military installations anymore. They targeted entire cities. Their incendiary payloads turned wooden neighborhoods into seas of fire that consumed everything: homes, hospitals, schools, temples. Strategic raids demolished power plants, rail junctions, shipyards, and arsenals. The country's once proud industrial base, already straining under resource shortages, was systematically annihilated. Trains stopped running for lack of fuel. Communications lines fell silent as telephone exchanges were reduced to rubble. Even basic necessities became scarce as warehouses and distribution centers went up in flames. Japan's economy, already on the brink, collapsed under the relentless weight of the bombing campaign. Inside military headquarters, the mood shifted from defiance to despair. Senior officers who had once dismissed the new bombers as technological curiosities now spoke openly of their unstoppable power. Air defense strategies were revised again and again, but each new tactic collapsed under the same brutal realities. The guns could not reach high enough, the fighters could not climb fast enough, and the radar systems could not react quickly. Enough! Reports of catastrophic losses arrived almost daily, detailing the obliteration of vital infrastructure and the disintegration of supply lines. The situation grew so dire that even the Imperial General Headquarters, once confident in its ability to wage a long and attritional war, began discussing contingency plans for the defense of the home islands, not from invasion, but from annihilation. From above, the psychological effect on the population was just as devastating as the physical destruction. Entire cities lived under a constant pall of smoke and fear. Children learned to identify the distinct engine sounds of the B-29 by ear. Mothers taught their families how to dig fire breaks in their yards and how to recognize the whistle of incendiary. Bombs! Those who survived one raid often returned to find nothing left of their homes but ashes. Families that had lived for generations in the same neighborhood scattered across the countryside, carrying with them only what they could hold. People stopped asking whether the bombers would come. They asked only when. For many civilians, the turning point was the sheer regularity of the devastation. The raids were not heroic duels or decisive battles. They were a mechanical process, methodical and unrelenting. The bombers came in the morning, in the afternoon, in the dead of night. They struck cities that had no military value, towns that had never seen a soldier. They did not need to aim precisely. Their payloads were so vast and their targets so large that destruction was inevitable. The war had once been fought by soldiers and sailors. Now it was fought by machines that seemed to exist beyond the reach of human courage. Even within the government, once so committed to the ideology of never surrendering, cracks began to show. Ministers who had scoffed at the idea of defeat now whispered privately about the impossibility of continuing the war. Cabinet meetings became dominated by grim discussions about how much longer the country could function under the relentless bombing. The emperor's advisors, once shielded from the day-to-day consequences of the air campaign, began receiving reports not just of industrial losses, but of mass civilian casualties and social collapse. The bombers had not merely crippled Japan's war machine, they had struck at the very foundation of its society. By the time the final waves of B-29s began to appear in late July, there was little left to destroy. Entire cities were reduced to charred skeletons of wood and steel. Transportation had ground to a halt, industry had ceased to function, and still the bombers came, as if to prove that there would be no reprieve, no sanctuary, no corner of the nation untouched by their reach. The realization that Japan could not win the war no longer belonged solely to pilots who failed to intercept, the bombers or to engineers who could not match their technology. It now belonged to the generals who watched their armies starve, the ministers who watched their government falter, and the civilians who watched their skies grow dark with the silhouettes of destruction. The bombers had not simply defeated Japan's defenses. They had dismantled its capacity to wage war and its will to continue it, and in doing so, they had broken an empire. By the final weeks of the war, the truth had become undeniable, even to the most devoted believers in the old ways. What Japan's pilots had first encountered as strange brown planes over the Pacific were no longer just enemy bombers. To them, they were something else entirely, a new philosophy of warfare made flesh and steel, a shift so profound that it rendered everything they had once believed about air combat irrelevant. The Zero's nimbleness, the pilot's reflexes, the tactics honed through years of duels. None of it mattered against an adversary that no longer fought within those boundaries. The skies themselves had changed. The realization dawned slowly at first, carried in fragments, the altitude that their engines could not reach, the speed that stretched beyond their fastest interceptors, the range that allowed bombers to cross oceans, the payload that erased entire cities in a single mission. Each of these factors, taken alone, was formidable. Together, they formed something unstoppable, a vision of war in which victory did not depend on the courage of individual pilots, but on the industrial power and technological innovation that put those pilots in the air in the first place. For Japan's aviators, trained to see air combat as a contest of skill and spirit, it was a disorienting revelation. They were no longer fighting men. They were fighting a system, one that extended from the factory floor to the far reaches of the stratosphere. The B-29 epitomized this transformation. It was more than an aircraft. It was an ecosystem. Its range allowed it to strike from bases thousands of miles away, making geography, once Japan's greatest ally, irrelevant. Its payload meant that a single raid could devastate not just a target, but an entire city, crippling supply networks and morale in ways that months of traditional warfare could not. Its pressurized cabins and turbo-supercharged engines allowed it to cruise at altitudes that few fighters could reach, and its speed rendered interception a costly and often fruitless endeavor. Even its production spoke to the new reality. These machines were not handcrafted like Japan's fighters, but assembled in vast quantities, each one nearly identical to the last, each one replaceable in weeks. For the pilots who had spent their careers mastering the art of the dogfight, this new era felt almost alien. Their world had been one of close-range duels, where a single turn or a split-second decision could mean the difference between life and death. They had believed that the pilot was the decisive factor, that courage and instinct could overcome mechanical disadvantages. But the B-29 and the doctrine it embodied showed that this was no longer true. The center of gravity in warfare had shifted away from individual valor and toward collective capability. War was now fought not by lone aces, but by vast industrial machines, supported by research, logistics, and coordination on a national scale. Even Japan's most decorated veterans understood this as they watched the bombers pass overhead in formation, their engines droning with a steady, indifferent rhythm. "We fought the enemy in front of us," one pilot would later write, "but the real enemy was the foundry, the laboratory, the factory, and we had no way to fight that." It was a sobering lesson and a portent of the future. The implications extended far beyond Japan. Militaries around the world studied the lessons of the air war and drew the same conclusion. The era of the individual pilot as the decisive force in battle was over. The new age would be defined by long-range strategic bombing, by machines that could project power across continents, and by air forces built not on heroism but on engineering and supply chains. In the decades to come, this philosophy would evolve even further, shaping the development of jet bombers, nuclear delivery systems, and eventually intercontinental missiles. The war in the Pacific had not just ended one chapter of aerial warfare. It had written the first lines of the next. For Japan's pilots, the lesson was bitter but clear. The brown plains they had once dismissed, then feared, had shown them the future. Speed, altitude, range, and payload, when fused with the power of a nation's industry, had transformed the very nature of war. It was no longer enough to outfly an enemy. One had to outbuild him, outthink him, and outproduce him. When the war finally ended and the last bombers returned to their bases, many of those pilots looked up at the empty skies with a strange mixture of awe and defeat. They had witnessed the passing of an era and the birth of another. The battles they had trained for, the skills they had dedicated their lives to perfecting, belonged to the past. Above them, in the contrails that had once darkened their skies, they saw the shape of the future, not a fleet of planes, but the shadow of a new kind of power that would define the modern age. The brown planes had not just won a war, they had changed what war itself would mean.